Hello, everybody. I'm Vanessa, your speaker for today. I'm really excited to get started with you guys. If you guys have any questions, I'll be here. You can go ahead and ask through the chat at any time, and I'll do my best to keep up with you guys. I did mention in the chat that I do recommend wearing headphones for this breakout session. There are spots where in the video that the volume sort of adjusts. So let's go ahead and just get started. Let's have fun. But the React from Scratch breakout session. My name is Vanessa Kasun, and I'll be the one walking through this breakout session with you today. I'd like to first and formally welcome you from the... Is anybody having problems hearing? Okay, good. Virtual setting. I know it's a little bit different than any of the previous years that you may have attended at the HDC, but we do appreciate everybody all the same, and we're excited that everybody's here, and I really, really, really look forward to walking through this with you and getting a good foundational concept of React. So let's go ahead and just get started and just dive right into what we'll be working on. So if you're wanting to build a modern website or application that needs high performance and safety, then you have come to the right breakout session. Learning React.js is going to provide you the necessary skills to do that. And today, most developers are loving the new web frameworks and technologies that are built on React, some of them being WordPress blocks or the Gatsby site framework. And those are just to name a few. So what does this mean for you exactly? This means that you can't run from learning React if you want to stay present and up to date with other developers. It's something that's modern. It's made off from Facebook. Twitter uses it. So it is a modern language, or a modern library, and it's something that you want to definitely have under your belt. So in this breakout session, you're going to obtain the knowledge that you need to understand the beginning concepts of React, and you're going to be able to build a simple React application. We won't have time to deploy it to the web. It wasn't my initial plan, but we have to be respectful of the time, and I really want to focus on the building of the application more than the actual deployment of the application. So my apologies for that, but if you do need to information about how to deploy it and put it onto GitHub in your repository and onto the web, there are many different resources that I can direct you in at the end of the breakout session. So before we get started, if you don't have any of the prerequisites, you can still be a full-fledged part of this breakout session. However, it will be a heck of a lot easier for you to understand and really follow along with the breakout session if you have a basic understanding of HTML and CSS, fundamental JavaScript concepts, so arrays, conditionals, objects, and being familiar with the JavaScript ES6 features, so the class syntax, arrow function, object destructuring, and so on. So what is React? So React can also be known as React.js or React.js, and it's an open source JavaScript library for building UI components or isolated chunks of code. And so many people confuse sometimes a framework with React with a framework because of its behaviors and capabilities, but technically it is a library. So don't forget that because of its behavior and capabilities. React is only concerned with rendering data in the DOM, and so creating React apps usually will require the use of additional libraries for state management and routing. Redux and React Router are respective examples of such libraries. We're not going to use those in this example. The only other library that we'll be using is the UUID, which is a unique, universal unique identifier, which we'll be using to add those to our to-do items. So we need to understand React thoroughly, and to do so, we need to start thinking in React components. So what we can think of when we think of a React component is a simple function that you can call with some input, and then it's going to render some output. And just like we use reuse functions, we can also reuse components. And then when you merge them together, you can create that sweet, complex user interface. So what I want to do from here is take a look at the actual to-do list that we're going to be creating. And then also, oh, I took it out of here. So we'll actually hold off on that for a second, but you'll see it here in this diagram. So this is basically what we're going to be creating in our browser. Just a simple to-do app, and each of these different parts of this app are going to be broken down into 5 individual components. The parent component being the to-do container, and then the other ones being its children components, but they will all be communicating respectively with each other. So we have our header component, our input to-do component, our to-do list, and our to-do item, and you can see the color that outlines each one of these individual components that we'll be breaking down together. So it's really, really fun. I think you guys will really have a fun time putting it together and getting to work with components. So quickly, let's just take a look at what a component looks like within some code. Like I said, it's pretty basic if you already have some foundational knowledge. So we always, in our React component files, need to import the React library and the React DOM script, and this is going to be only in our parent container, or our parent component. So we're creating a class, giving our component a name. So for this example, this component name is car, and we're extending out the React component. And further along in the video, I'll talk about a different way that you can sort of set this up by importing the component up here instead of extending it down here. Also, when we create a component, we always need a render method and an input, return statement inside of that render method. And this is where the information is going to be actually displayed. And every bit of information, every bit of data, every component needs to be wrapped inside of an HTML element, whether that be your standard p tag, a div, a section, an article, an h1 through h6, that doesn't matter. It just needs to be wrapped in an HTML element every time. We'll also notice down here that we have the React DOM render, and it's calling this car component that we've created here. So this is what is showing up in the browser. Hi, I am a car. And we're sort of communicating here between our HTML file that we're also going to have in our folders and in our public folder, and it's not going to contain any actual HTML coding. We can technically, if we want to, code React directly into HTML. However, we're not going to go about it in this breakout session, but this is what it'll look like, and you can see it's created that root ID in this div tag, and here we're grabbing that root ID by this get element callback here, and then we're rendering that in our browser. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on going over what virtual DOM is or what DOM is, because as you know, front-end developers, or as at least somebody who has knowledge of computer science, that you've had to, at some point, have had some interaction with your web development using the DOM. So quickly, whenever an HTML document is loaded in the browser, which in our project, this is going to be the content document that that the JavaScript is going to be able to manipulate. What it does, it creates an object-based representation of that HTML. So it's not the actual HTML, it's just an object-based representation. So this way, JavaScript can connect and dynamically manipulate that DOM because it can read and understand its object-based format. Make it possible to add, modify content, or perform actions on web pages. So next I want to talk about setting up our actual working environment. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code for this. And before we even do that, we need to make sure that we have Node.js installed on our machines. So if you go to nodejs.org/en/download/, or simply type it in into Google. It will bring it up for you, and you can click on the download URL. And go ahead and click on the corresponding download installer that you'll need for your specific operating system. I'm not going to really walk through the installation process just because that's something that you guys should have done before previously if you don't already have it. And once you do have that installed, you'll set that up through the install wizard, whether it's Windows or Mac. You can double check to make sure that it's been downloaded and installed correctly by running the node version command, and it'll pop up and show the version number that you've installed and are using. And if there are any complications when you're running into download, just uninstall and reinstall, and you'll be 100% fine. You'll be good. So once you have that installed on your local machine, we're going to open our terminal in whatever IDE of choice you prefer. I'll be using Visual Studio Codes again. And what we're going to be doing is I want to change the directory that I'm going to be putting this application in. I'm going to be creating it in. So I'm going to grab that from my GitHub folder really quick. I'm just going to copy this path and change directories here. Like so that I'm in my GitHub folder. And then in order to create the actual React app itself, we're going to run the node command of npx and then create React app. And then we're going to name this app to simple to-do list, like so. And then you're going to press enter, and it's going to automatically generate and populate all of the folders that are needed in order to continue on and create the React app. I already have the app created inside of my folders here. You can see once I'm in my GitHub folder, I have the simple to-do list, and then we'll talk about the corresponding folders here in just a moment. Wait on our web. You can ignore and delete everything except for the index.html or the index.html file inside of that public folder. Because this is a React from scratch breakout session, we're literally going to be creating it from the ground up, so we won't need anything else inside of there. Okay. In the source folder, you will not see the components folder. You will see apps.css. You will see index.js. You'll also see apps.js, apps.test.js, and a couple of other folders and files. You can go ahead and delete everything, again, that's inside of that source folder, but keep index.js and apps.css. And apps.css will already have some CSS code in it, so go ahead and delete that as well. We'll talk about the components folder that we'll be creating here in a second. If you're looking at the other two folder or files that are inside of here, these are our packets.json files, and these are where all of our dependencies are located. We're also not going to mess with this for the time being, but it also tells you everything that's being loaded and used. Okay? So that's pretty neat. So the first thing that we need to do inside of our IDE is to actually go ahead and change directories into that directory we created. So if you're not already in that directory, use that cd command and type in cd simple to-do list or whatever you created the project so that it reads that in your terminal. Then what we're going to do is we're going to actually start the server so that it brings up our files in the browser. So to do that, we're going to run the node code of npm start. And it might take a second since I already have it loaded up here in my browser. And I have taken a couple steps a few steps ahead. With some respect to time for this breakout session, it is necessary to do so. So please make sure you keep that in mind as we're going along here, that some of this code that you're seeing, all of this code that you're seeing is already typed out. You will just need to follow along, possibly pause the video if you need to copy some code. Okay, so first and foremost, let's talk about the index.html file. We know that we need an HTML file to render in the actual browser itself. That's sort of foundational concepts of Web Development 101. But you can see that nothing is actually in here. You'll see that the title, I've changed it to simple to-do list. Yours will be reading React app, I believe. So go ahead and change that so that it renders that inside of the browser, like so. And we can pretty much ignore everything else that's in here. This is just all the metadata that we're needing in order for this to render properly. And you can see here that nothing is actually inside of the HTML. It's just a template. What we're doing is actually grabbing the root ID, which is going to be located inside of our index.js file. So let's go ahead and move there. So all you need to change here before we move on is the title. Okay. So if you go into your index.js folder or file, go ahead and take a look at the information that's in there. You will have the import React from the React library, and you'll also be importing the DOM scripts from that library as well. Go ahead and add the import to-do container from our components folder that we're going to be creating here in just a second. So once you have that imported, go ahead and also change the element that is being rendered inside the DOM render method. And what this is doing is rendering this component that we'll be creating in React, and we're also getting the element by our ID root here. So remember, in index.html, we have this ID of root that we are creating, and in our index.js, this is what we're calling. So this is what's actually being rendered here in our HTML file, which is going to be our to-do container. Okay, so before we move on to the actual to-do container itself, go ahead and make that components folder inside of the source folder, and in each single individual file, let's go ahead and focus on the to-do container first. What I want you to do in the to-do container is, before we even talk about code, is to go into your terminal. If you have it open already, if your browser is running, go ahead and Control-C and stop that browser so that we can run some node commands here to install some packages that we'll need. So if you take a look at the code, you see that we're importing from UUID, and UUID is a universal unique identifier. So what we're going to be doing is creating to-do items that have individual IDs associated with them, and giving them an individual key so that when we call them, there's no errors in our browser. But we need to import this library and install this library first before we do that. So in your terminal, type in the command npm install UUID. And that will then install all of the UUID information that you'll need. And once you've installed it, run and open your server by running npm start once more, and it will automatically be uploaded and updated in your node module folder. Okay, so we won't need to mess with any of that in our nodes module folder, because everything should be downloading just fine if we're in our correct folder. And remember, we are in our simple to-do list folder. So now that we have these this library imported with our UUID import here, and we're using our version 4. So this is version 4. Okay, so on our line 6, and that's actually starting the creation of our React component. So we're creating a class and we're calling it to-do-container, which is the name of our JS file that we created, and we're extending out the React component from that React library up at the top. That's why we need that. And then if we look at line 7, we're starting the initial code, and we are defining an object here called state. And before I define what states and props are, I want to really talk, I want to focus on working with the data. So when we're creating a React app, you really can't do much of anything without having components receiving or passing data from one another. So it may be a child component receiving data from its parent, or it may be the user directly inputting data into that specific component. And our example will have both, right? So understanding how to work with data is crucial to building React components. We're not going to know how to build them correctly if we don't understand states and props. So this brings me to the concepts of states and props. So we'll start with props. So what is a prop? It stands for properties, and this can be thought of as an attribute in HTML. So for instance, the attributes type and checked are ones that we would use with the input tag. Okay, so there are primary ways to send data and or event handlers down the component tree. So quickly, for example, from parent to child component. When this happens, the data that's received in the child component becomes read-only, and it can't be changed by the child component. It cannot be. And this is because the data is owned by the parent component and can only be changed by the same parent component. So if that's a prop, what is a state? So props allow a child component to receive data from its parent. So what happens when the user inputs data directly into a component? Well, that's where we have states. So you can think of a state as data you can store to a specific component, and this data is owned and can be updated by the component holding it. So this makes the state local to that component. So anytime that you want to use some data and have it be updated whenever the user performs some action, like doing the input field or perhaps toggling the menu button, then you have to make use of the states. So that's what we're doing here. We're creating our state object, okay? And this is going to carry out the responsibility of accepting our user input and our input to do. Okay, so we need to store and place the data, in this case, store its state, which is received through the input, and so from there, we can display the data in the front end, right? So we haven't created input to do yet, but we're gonna take the information that they input and store it in a state, right? But we also need to add props because we have something that's going to sort of remain the same. The user is not going to input anything. These are going to be props to actual items in our array, okay? So that's what we're doing here in this state. So we're setting up our state, we're calling it to-dos, creating that array, and inside of our array, we have our objects. So we have item 1, item 2, and item 3. And if you are looking at the browser, you can see that these items are correlating with our code. So the first one is the title of setup development environment, and so on and so forth, going down the line here. Okay, so that's what we're doing. We're setting our state using this UU ID for our IDs here. Okay, that's all we're doing is just initializing and setting up that state. And so what we're doing down at the bottom is finishing up our creation of our component by coding the render method, which is returning our to-do list component. And we need to take note that our to-do list component is being wrapped inside of an HTML element, and this needs to be done for each individual React component that we're creating. Anytime we're rendering some output, it needs to be wrapped in an HTML element. Also take note that each of our component files has an export default of itself. Since we'll be importing these files into each other, since they'll need to be able to communicate and display together and work off of each other, we need to be able to export them and import them to one another. So we can't forget to have that always in each of our React components. So let's next focus on the to-do list. And before actually we even do that, let's take a look at to-do item. Because if we remember correctly, the to-do list is what's going to pass the data down the tree, right? This is what we're doing. So let's take a look at the to-do item, because really our to-do list needs the to-do item itself. So what the to-do item is another component. And remember, we've created these in our components folder. So in to-do item, what we're doing is creating our component on line 3, again, importing our React library, rendering always and returning always something. And right now we're just returning these list item titles. And that's what's actually showing up in our browser, right? Are these as list items. So what is this saying? We're taking this props to do, and we're displaying the title. Well, this dot props, remember, properties is like an HTML attribute. So we're taking a property of our to-do array and grabbing the title. Okay, and where is this coming from? This is coming from our state here. Our title is here. This is a property of each one of these individual objects. Okay, so we're taking this and passing it through here. So what the to-do list is doing is mapping through each one of those props and displaying them. And what they're doing is not only displaying them by their ID, but it's initializing the unique identifier with this keyword here. Okay, so we're calling our to-do element, or to-do item, right, inside of our return. So we're setting up that function here, and we're having it output the actual to-do item. And remember, our to-do item is calling the title. But what we're doing in our list is setting our ID equal to that key value. That's what we want in order to avoid issues inside of our browser. Okay, we could set up a conditional statement, a mathematical conditional statement, where it loops through each one of those ID, incrementing up or adding some sort of symbol or number or something to give it that unique value it's ourselves. But for all intents and purposes for this breakout session, we're going to be using the UUID to eliminate some code and some time. And then we're just, again, setting to do equal to our to-do objects, the to-dos themselves, okay? Again, exporting each of these components, whether it be to-do list, to-do item, or to-do container. So these are the first 3 components that we've created so far. And this is just to render a simple list in our actual browser. And you can see here we're using our React developer tools. Again, just for reiteration, you need to have this in order to debug correctly, because you will be able to see that not only am I able to view this information in my console and ignore this error because it's irrelevant, but I can click on this Components tab, which is given to me by this React Developers Tool extension in Chrome, and able to see each one of my components that are being rendered. And you can see here those unique key values that the UUID library has given us. You can also see my props here and our to-do, our state here. Okay, you can see it's being rendered by this version of our DOM script, and this is the source that it's being rendered from. Okay, so another very handy tool to have there as well. On is changing our items into checkboxes, so that way we can set them to either being completed or incompleted, and then also being able to handle that change in our event handler in the to-do container. So the first thing we need to do is pass each one of them down to each other. Okay, so the to-do item component, which is the one that's going to handle the checkboxes, can't change the state data in the parent component, the to-do container. And the to-do container is the one that holds all the state data. Okay, so remember, this is the only state, or this is the to-do container is the only component that would be able to change it. Okay, so we need to find a way to access the state data from the to-do item and toggle the completed value true or false in the to-do container component. So we need to raise an event from the to-do item up a level to the to-do list and then into the to-do container component. And the to-do item component is going to raise the event, while the parent component, which is our to-do container, is going to handle that event. And the way we do this is going to be through props. Okay? So it's kind of tricky, but trust me, it's actually really simple. So you can either go from the child to the parent component or the other way around. So I prefer the latter, where we're going from to-do item, to-do list, to the to-do container, okay? So that is what we're doing there, okay? We are adding that event in here, and we'll handle it inside of our to-do container. So what we're doing is we're updating this state using the set state method here in this handler. So our aim here is to change the state of the checkboxes whenever it's clicked, right? And so in React, we don't modify the states directly. Instead, we update through a method we inherit by that extending React component up here. So what the set state method does is it tells React that we're updating the state. It figures out what part of the state that's being changed and then updates only that part in the real DOM. So all we need to do in the handle change method is to check if the ID of the checkbox matches any of the to-do items IDs. If it does, then we flip the completed value from true to false and vice versa. Items from the to-dos. So this is going to be some we handled the input checkboxes. Here also the input to-do items have to live in the to-do container here, and while the delete button is going to live in the actual to-do item component. So this means, again, we're going to be raising an event from our to-do item here. That's what we're doing here in our button element, and we're going to move up levels through the to-do list.js folder into our to-do container component where the event's going to be handled. So that's where we start here in our to-do item by creating that button element and raising that event by the onClick handler, and then specifying the to-do method that we're going to be creating in the to-do container. Okay. So let's look at the to-do container here. What we're doing is we're taking the ID and we're again rendering that set state method, and we're using the filter method with it as well. And this is another higher order function like the map method, and what it does is it returns a new array by applying a condition on every array element. So in this case, we only want to return the to-do items that don't match the ID that will be passed in. So for this example, the collect ID, and any ID that matches it will be then deleted. So that's what we have here. Also with the filter method, we're saying that for each one of these to-dos data that we're looping through, we want to retain the ones whose IDs are not equal to the IDs passed in. Okay. Also note that the 3 dots here, the spread separator, it's needed for this code. It's necessary for this to work because it allows us to grab the current code's to-do item or the to-do items at every point. So that's important to note there. Also, let's not forget to pass this through our to-do list, just like we did for that checkbox handle change event. where we were clicking the checkbox and changing the value from true to false. So you can see here in the browser that all of these are clicked and are set to true, right? So if I were to click these, you can see also in the inspector that they're changing the value to false, and that is the updates that we made in that previous section. So let's also next switch our focus onto adding the input field in the submit button. I want to make sure that everybody is to this point at this part of the breakout session. With the code that we've talked about thus far, we should be able to click our checkboxes and change the value to true or false depending upon what is clicked. And then now that we've learned how to delete each one of these, you should be able to go ahead and delete each one of those items, and then on the refresh, have that regenerate. Also notice that our props has been updated with the corresponding information via our code. Okay. Also being rendered by our to-do container. Here just a couple of updates since the previous video. So with that being said, let's go ahead and switch gears, and let's focus on adding our input for our user to be able to add another to-do item, and then being able to go about handling events on there as well. So through our input to-do.js, first and foremost, go ahead and create a component as you know how to do. But while you're doing that, take a look at the screen and pay attention to line 1, code on line 1. You can see the difference between that import and the import in my to-do list, right? So here you can see I'm just importing React from the React library, and in my input to do, I'm importing a React component, the React component from my React library. And again, in my to-do items or to-do list, when I'm defining that class here, I'm extending out to the React component. So I'm not importing it here, but I'm extending out here specifically. And so the only difference is that I'm just sort of switching up the way I'm doing that. I'm importing it here so I don't have to extend here. And that's just something that you can do based upon your own preference. But it is something that I believe is worthy of knowing. So let's now focus on this state where we're setting it equal to an empty string, and the empty string has a variable name of title. And the title is to give the user, whatever the user types in is then going to become the title. So if I typed in on one of my to-do items, to do laundry would then become my title, right? And so where is this being used at? Specifically, it's being used in this input element in my return render method here. So we can ignore this line 14 for now. We'll talk about that in the next section. But let's focus on this input element here. We're giving it the basic attribute and values that it needs. We're giving it our type value, adding a placeholder, giving it our class name for CSS, which we can also ignore for the time being, naming it title, and then here is where this value, this title, is coming into play. So we're going to be setting the value of this to-do item to the one that the user inputted into the text field, which was given to this title variable that we're calling here now. And we also need to make sure that we have this on change event here, because we also need to be able to click and delete and do whatever with this to-do item, just as our other ones as well. So let's see. So we need to handle the event and update the state. So when we do that, we're going to, let's focus on line 7 here. So what we're doing is, in the set state method, we're passing the current value of the state, so our input text, to the title, which is our target value here. And if you recall from vanilla JavaScript DOM API, The predefined parameter E holds the same important information about the event. So from there, you can target the specific input field and grab the updated value, okay? So if you're, for instance, if the form that you want to use or the one you're creating requires fields for the names, emails, passwords, first you'd want all of those fields included in the state and assign them to an empty string. You would want to put that here. So for passwords, username, so on and so forth. And then after that, you would have to modify it a little bit, but for the most part, it would look similar to this here, okay? So adding the name attribute to each of the input tags, assigning the value of the same name declared in the states. If, again, to reiterate the name of title here. So that's how we are adding our to-do item from user input, okay? So now we're going to focus on updating so that when the user actually types something in and clicks enter, it's going onto our list and we're able to actually do something with it like the other three items that we already have. So what we need to do first and foremost is we're going to be doing this in the input to-do component as opposed to the to-do item like we've been doing, and in our to-do list like we've been doing as well. So the first thing we need to do is wrap our input into a form element. We can go ahead and give it the class name and start really paying attention. And if you haven't already, adding these class names in here, because we'll be talking about the CSS in this portion of the video as well. But adding this form element and calling back this onSubmit callback, and also adding this input element down here and noticing that we don't have the on-click event listener here. And that's because if we did, we wouldn't be able to respond to submit events triggered from the keyboard or by pressing enter. And that's just like really bad user experience. So by using the onSubmit callback, that's what we cover both cases. So that's why we're doing that here. You don't see that event listener. But if we focus up here on line 12, here's where we're creating this event listener here, that onSubmit here, and we can see that we're preventing the default handling of the onSubmit, and then we're updating the set state method because this needs to be done live in our to-do container. So we're just updating that state with the title that the user types in when they press enter. And we're also calling this add to do the state title. And if we come in our to do container here, not only do we need to add our input to do down here if we haven't already, the add to do, calling this up here, this function up here where we're actually creating a constructor, deconstructing this down and creating that new to-do item, assigning it those key value pairs, creating that object, assigning it the key value pairs with our unique identifier, the title, and we're setting the completed value to false, because when then initially the user inputs something or types something and it's probably not going to be done off top, that's why they're adding it to their to-do list, right? And then again, updating that set state method using this separator here that's hitting every single point in our to-dos and updating it, okay? And then again, calling it down here. So having all of this updated with our onChange handler here and our state object, all that stuff within the updates with our to-do container, our to-do items, which we're not 100% completely up to date on there, and our to-do list, which we're done with here, and making sure that all of these are communicating together. So don't forget to actually import the input to do inside of your to-do container. That way we can communicate effectively. So once you save that and get all of that code in there, again, pausing to look at the code if you need to, just because we need to have some respect to the time for this breakout session. But being able to go in here and pause and catch up if you need to is completely fine. But at this point, you should see something like this in your browser. We have, you will not see this simple to-do app and the header here. We'll be creating that in just a moment when we talk about CSS and such. But seeing adding a to-do item here, being able to click submit or not even click submit. So if I add a to-do item, click enter, being able to click enter and having that handled. So being able to also click and check each one of these. And remember seeing the values change here as we're clicking the check boxes or deleting them altogether. Okay, so being able to do all of that up until this point in the browser is where we should be. So it's coming along nicely, and we'll just keep on moving forward. So before I cover our header component here, I want to make sure that everybody has the stop and double check to make sure that you have gone through the code. And I have showed you guys this code multiple times. That's pretty much all you've seen throughout this entire video is the code. So making sure that you have the correct class names or the classes associated so that when we're creating them in our app CSS file, that it's showing up in the browser correctly. And so I believe that's all we have so far up until this point is up in our to-do container. So we'll move on to header.js and the apps CSS portion of this project, just because I feel like that's something you guys should already have a basic understanding of under your belt. The main focus is going to be the inline CSS that we'll be working with in our header.js file and also in our to-do.js file as well. So let's actually take first a look at the apps CSS file. And you can pause at any point in time in this video to get caught up to this point or to type in what you see on my screen. I won't be covering any of the property value pairs in any of these selectors. They're basic property and value selectors that you'll see on any app or things that you've worked all with before. So again, taking the time to get caught up or styling this however you want to, if you're sort of winging off on your own and getting the basics down but styling things differently or naming things differently, classes and such, then please by all means do that. That's not a problem. No arguments or issues there. So with that being said, let's move forward on into our header.js file. What I want to focus on is the creation of this object, this constructor here. And what we're doing is naming it header style and setting some CSS styling to it. And then here in our actual header element in our return statement is where we're actually applying this style. So we can do it one of two ways, by creating an object and applying it using the style tag here or the style attribute and calling it inside of our double curly braces or inside of the curly braces here. Or we can just simply do inline CSS by creating our regular elements that are containing our content and then creating and adding that style attribute with the normal inline type of CSS. And it's really basic. It's not anything extraordinary. The biggest thing that you need to focus on and worry about is understanding the syntax and all of these, really noticing the double curly brackets here and so on and so forth, but not a whole lot of difficult concepts need to be covered in CSS. Also, if we're looking at our to-do items.js file, we're also needing to create a completed style object so that when the user clicks on something and they're finished with it, that style will be completed, hence that like cross out that we have and so on. And so we're adding this new span tag. We're introducing this new span tag here. We're giving it the attribute of style there. And then we're using the ternary operator in the style attribute. And we're doing this to dynamically change the CSS style if any of the to-do items are completed. So that's what we're using here in order to determine whether or not this style is being completed. Is it checked yes or no? Is it true or false? So on and so forth. Okay? And so once that's done, once everything is added in here, please make sure that you are going into your index.js file and adding and importing that external apps CSS file in there so it'll show up in your browser. That's an important step not to forget to do, to add that not into the to-do container, but remember the apps CSS where we're rendering into that root ID or HTML. Okay? So those can communicate and talk to each other. Also, please make sure that you've got, again, all the class names and everything as I do. So that way, when you save the file and you bring it up in the browser, you will see the final product of this to-do app. And again, adding a to-do item, being able to press enter, being able to click either any one of these, changing the state of whether it's true or false, handling that, also being able to delete, handling that event, and being able to actually do handle the event of pressing enter and submit itself and running that, displaying it in the list. So that is it for this tutorial, this breakout session, this React from Scratch. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And please, if there's any issues with it, go back in the video, watch it again and again as many times as you need to. Also, if you're interested in signing up for any of the courses at AIM's Code School, I would be glad to talk about that in the Q&A. So thank you. Have a good
All right, that's it. That's all I have. I have to go mediate another breakout session, but if you guys have any questions, I will leave my email in the comment section, and you guys feel free to reach out to me at any time. Thank you. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.